Shalom. Welcome to the Ger in Every Parsha. This is Parsha Tazria. Now, Parsha Tazria starts out, Vaydaber Hashem el Moshe lemor, Deber el Bnei Yisrael lemor, Isha ki Tazria, Vayalda Zachar Vatama, Shivas Yamim, Kime, Nidas Doisa Titma. The English translation is Hashem spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the children of Israel, saying, when a woman conceives and gives birth to a male, she shall be impure for a 7-day period, as during the days of her menstruant infirmity shall she be impure." And then the next verse goes on to say that on the 8th day you should circumcise the male child. Now, what does this have to do with the Ger? Have you ever wondered where Gentiles came from? Where the nations came from? Why there is such a separation of Gentiles and Jews? And what the whole story is behind that? Well, in this week's Parsha, the sages take this first part about the woman giving birth and they all relate it back to the creation story. And the perfect example is in Rashi, in the very first pasuk in the Parsha. He says that when a woman conceives, the Amora Rav Simloi said, just as the fashioning of man came after all cattle, beasts, and fowl, in the Torah's account of the act of creation, so is his law explained after the law of cattle, beasts, and fowl. So it gives a midrash, but you see that it's referring back to the creation story about man being created and also about man being born. And then he goes on to explain that even if she gives birth without blood, she's still impure. That this impurity is a spiritual impurity, and that also there is, it looks like a Talmudic saying in Nida 63b that if a woman sees blood, she feels ill, and her head and her limbs feel heavy upon her. I guess she gets a little queasy. So they want to relate this to this commandment to the creation story. And why? Because if you remember in the creation story, because of the sin, the woman, one of the curses on the woman is that she should have menstruation, that she should suffer. And there's two words for suffering in that pasuk. And the sages learn out that that is the blood of menstruation, and either the blood of the bris or the blood of the birth. I can't remember. But in the future, when Mashiach comes and the curses are lifted, this will no longer happen. A woman will not bleed by childbirth, and she will have no pain. So the being impure for 7 days has to do with the idea that because Eve sinned by eating the fruit, she brought this upon herself. And so this being impure for 7 days and being separated from her husband is a rectification of this sin, because the sages say that when Eve did this, that the serpent actually raped Eve. You can find this in, I'll try and post it on the video when I edit it, but it's in the Talmud Bavli Shabbos 146a. And it says that the primal serpent seduced Eve, and he cast impurity into her and passed on to future generations of men. In the case of Israel, who stood at Mount Sinai to accept the Torah, their impurity was removed, and they were returned to their original uncontaminated state. Thus they are today free of impurity. In the case of idolaters, however, who did not stand at Mount Sinai, their impurity was not removed. It thus persists to this day. And the Gemara asks, Rav Acha, the son of Rava, said to Rav Ashi, what about converts who did not stand at Mount Sinai? He said to him, even though they themselves were not there, their mazzels were there. For it is written in a verse that identifies those with whom the covenant of Sinai was made, those who are standing here with us today before Hashem, our God, and those who are not here, etc., with us today. This teaches that even those who would only later join the Jewish nation were present in some form at the revelation at Sinai. Their presence there caused their impurity to be removed. The Gemara cites a dissenting opinion. And this Rav Yochanan's statement is contrary to the opinion of Rav Abba Bar Kahana. And Rav Abba Bar Kahana said, not until 3 generations had passed was the impurity introduced into Eve by the serpent removed from our forefathers. For we see that Abraham sired Yishmael, a product of his impurity, while Yitzchak sired Esav, a product of his impurity. But Yaakov sired the 12 tribes, in whom there was no aberration. All were free of the serpent's contamination. Thus, Abba Bar Kahana holds that the Jews were freed of impurity with the birth of Yaakov long before the revelation at Sinai. So a couple things to point out. First is that when we're talking about this serpent raping Eve, we're obviously not talking literally or physically. We're talking about spiritually, something happened. And when it says that he injected his venom, makes sense, because a serpent bites a person and injects poisonous venom coming from the mouth. And this is what the serpent did, and that he injected a thought into Chava's mind that was poisonous and caused her to sin. And because it caused her to sin, it created a blemish in all human beings, because now egocentricity was introduced into the human psyche where it had not been there before. And so now selfishness was introduced into the human genome. And the sages describe it as that the poison was now the mixing of the 70 nations with the nation of Israel within the womb of Eve. And so originally it was meant that humanity was all supposed to be one, without the divisions of nations and nationalities and races of families. That wasn't supposed to be the case. Everybody was supposed to be, I guess, if you want to say, the archetype Israel. And there were not supposed to be any Goyim. So when the poison got introduced, this introduced the 70 nations and caused an impurity. Now 70 comes from the 7 days that the woman is to be impure, because 70 is the 10 Sefirot for each of the 7 emotive Sefirot that it represents. We see this in the counting of the Sefira. During Sefira Sa'omer, we say Chesed Sheba Gevura, Chesed Sheba Tiferet, so on and so forth. So this is an inter-inclusion of the Sefirot. So each sphere of the 7 emotive Sefirot are going to have the 10 Sefirot arrayed in its Sephirotic construct. So Gevura is going to have Chesed Sheba Gevura, Gevura Sheba Gevura, Tiferet, Sheva Gevura, so on and so forth. And so that gets us to the 70, and there are 70 archetypal souls amongst the Jewish people, which represent the godly soul, or the Nefesh Elokis, how it's brought down in Chassidut. And then there's 70 nations, which represent the animal soul, or the animalistic soul, that is governed by emotions. So these are concepts. Don't get hung up on the imagery and the sexuality of the language. Serpents can't procreate with human beings. That's idiocy, and to think like that is very immature and doesn't show a maturity in understanding. So we have to conceptualize everything and understand what's happening. So basically, what the sages are saying is that the sin introduced egocentricity into the human genome, which caused people to be selfish. And this is represented by the other nations, as the Jewish people are supposed to have three traits. They're supposed to be modest, merciful, and full of good deeds, gemilas chasadim, acts of kindness. So the Jews are supposed to be a kind people. Abraham was a kind person, and Abraham was the beginning of all the Jews. Also, you should notice that the Jews were also infected with this poison. It's not just the Goyim. The Jews also were infected, and we see this from the Gemara, how it says that Abraham gave over Yishmael. Well, children are thoughts, right? So the sages explain that when you are having relations, that your thoughts during relations have an effect on the kind of child that you're going to create, which makes sense because the seed comes from the brain of the father. Everything starts in the head of the father. So if your thoughts are corrupt, you're going to create corrupt seed. And so it only makes sense. The Goyim are personified selfishness, and they're contrary to godliness. They rebel against God and don't keep His commandments. And this is what the whole story in the Garden of Eden is all about, is you have a man who didn't keep a commandment. And so when you could say he was at the status of Yisrael before he sinned, and then after he sinned, he became like a goy. And the Gemara also mentions this. There's an opinion that he was a min after he sinned. So we see that the clear delineation between the Goyim and the Jews is not necessarily a physicality, but a spirituality. And that spirituality is a self-centeredness as opposed to an other-centeredness worldview. The Jew is supposed to have the other-centeredness worldview, where he considers others and is not selfish and will obey the commands of his creator. And the Goy has this selfish worldview where he doesn't want authority over him. He doesn't want a king or a creator over him commanding him what to do. He wants to be wild and hefker and follow his own desires, and he doesn't want a law to keep or a structure to bind him. And this is basically, at the end of the day, what it all boils down to. So again, we have tazria, the birth of a male child. The woman is impure for 7 days. These 7 days correspond to 7 days of nature, the animalistic soul, the 70 nations. He's circumcised on the 8th day. The 8th day represents miracles, like in the story of Hanukkah, which is coming up soon, and also transcends nature, the 7 days of nature. And therefore, that's why the Jewish child is circumcised on the eighth day, circumcision itself is removing a barrier between you and your partner, as it's removing skin, which is creating a barrier, which causes selfishness and self-centeredness. When you remove that barrier, you're becoming closer to your partner and more sensitive to the other. And that is the lesson of circumcision. Also goes along with tzarat, and we're going to get to that in Parsha Matzorah, which is going to be next. Thanks for listening. This has been the Ger in every Parsha.